Doctors of Reddit, what is your how the hell are you even alive right now? Story? I had an older fellow just last month who fell off a roof. Got up, drove about 12 kilometers home on a bumpy forest road, took a shower, and his wife made him come to the ER because he was a little short of breath. He had a flailed chest, dangerous number of rib fractures, blood around his heart and lungs, oh yeah, and something called a hangman's fracture in his neck. Drove on a bumpy road. Took a shower. Hangman's fracture. Wow. Hangman's fracture. That is incredibly morbid, and I love it. I was an MD at a VA hospital, and working with veterans. I've got 1,000 of these stories because seriously, nothing can kill a veteran. Anyone who works at a VA can confirm. Here's my best one. Vietnam vet, on a scout mission, when he and his two buddies take gunfire. He takes 2 bullets. One to his left thigh. Second bullet goes through the front of his helmet, grazes the right side of his head, down to but not through the bone. Because it went through the front of the helmet, the bullet doesn't have the velocity to exit the back of the helmet. Instead, it bounces off the inside of the helmet, ricochets down and to the left, and then passes through his neck within 1 inch of his brainstem and cervical spine. It continues into his chest, somehow missing major arteries including his aorta and pulmonary vessels, goes completely through his left lung, and gets stopped by one of his ribs. He's carried back by his buddies, who drop him several times in the thick jungle. Multiple surgeries, necrotizing fasciitis of leg wound, spends a month in a full body cast, 3 more months in rehab. Years later he complained that his left ribs hurt when he sits back against a hard chair. Surgeon finds bullet lodged under his rib, takes it out, problem solved. As he tells me this story, he pulls his wallet out and shows me the bullet. BAMF. Work with military a lot. Also come from Navy family. Can confirm. Vets are indestructible. There's one guy that I work with sometimes, who I'm convinced is just trolling death for the fun of it at this point. He did a double knee replacement without painkillers. He had 3 heart attacks, 2 bouts with cancer, served in Vietnam, got shot 2 different times, got hit by some shrapnel once, stayed active in the army for 30 years after that, got into a plane crash, ended up breaking the nose of one person that came to collect his body from the wreckage, and throwing another. He's in the hospital again now for some other thing the MDs are all worried about. But I've known this guy since my undergrad. Nothing short of the ducking apocalypse is going to kill the bastard. He's too stubborn. I'm pretty sure that the MDs are worried about the Terminator frame under his skin. I'm not a doctor, but just kidding. Yes I am. I just wanted to fit in. Honestly it was a guy who showed up to ER because he fell and broke his arm. Simple right? He also had a cough he couldn't kick. That's the only issues he had in his mind. Look at the guy for 1 second, and it's a whole new story. He was covered in skin cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, maybe 400 separate spots. Clearly HIV positive. We checked his blood, CD4 of ducking 6, normal 1200 plus, under 200 definitely immunocompromised. Super thin and frail guy, but he says he's always been thin. But man this guy is sick. So we give him a chest x-ray. Can barely see his lungs. They are covered by massive amounts of bacteria. In his case, tuberculosis, cake topper, diabetes, uncontrolled, with severe kidney problems, and also about a quarter as much hemoglobin as he should have. The list just goes on and on with him. So that's the most sick I've seen someone, I think. We did what we could with chest tube, antibiotics, other medication, HIV meds, and intensive care unit eventually. The guy died 6 days after showing up. It's like all the different diseases were too busy fighting each other to kill the patient. Cancer is thinking hey, let's move on to the lungs. Only to find tuberculosis they're saying duck off. We were here first. Go try the kidneys. Can't. Diabetes already laid claim. It's a toss-up between the guy who shot himself in the neck with a crossbow bolt and somehow missed his carotid arteries and jugular vein, or this old guy with dementia who fell down the stairs, broke his neck and his hip, and was still walking around A&E screaming why does it hurt when I walk? As someone who had a fractured neck and fractured hip after being run over by a car I can tell you shock is good and bad. I couldn't understand why my right leg kept collapsing while I walked around and waited for an ambulance. Eventually the shock took me out with no pulse and no breathing, but the responding crew took care of me, and 30 years later I'm still good. I remember when me and my boyfriend first found out he had diabetes. His blood sugar was over 900. We don't know exactly as the monitors they used only went up to 900 and couldn't read what it was at exactly, only that it was over 900. I remember the doctor turning to him and saying, "How the hell are you? Not in a coma right now? How the hell are you not dead right now?" Not the most comforting thing to hear a doctor say. Over 900, that's impossible. Edit, that's 900 milligrams. Literally the sweetest guy. Alright, here's a crazy one. The patient originally came in 4 hours prior because she was having an active heart attack. The patient is transferred to the cardiovascular ICU and a cardiologist is called in to do a cath to see what further treatment may need to be done for the heart. During the cath, it's discovered that the patient is having an abdominal aortic dissection. This is basically when the patient has a tear in the aorta and they are internally bleeding at a rapid pace. Shortly after the dissection is discovered and the surgeon is called, the patient codes. Patient goes into VFib/breathing stops. She coded for about a minute and was shocked back into a rhythm relatively quickly. The patient was fully alert minutes after the shock and the ER doc who was called down to work the code was communicating that she needed to be intubated and the surgeon was on his way to treat her. Long story short, the patient made it. That's one of the rare cases where the initial heart attack landed her in the right place at the right time, ultimately ended up saving her life. Last year, on Boxing Day, during the first few weeks of my EM rotation on A&E as an FY2, the day started quiet, which was apparently unusual for Boxing Day. Nothing major came in until around midday, when suddenly, I hear shouts for help. An unconscious little girl is rushed in, surrounded by a couple paramedics performing CPR. Within seconds there are literally dozens of doctors and nurses around this 6-year-old girl that is blue like a smurf. Apparently she had fallen into a freezing pond. We have a saying that a patient isn't dead till they are warm and dead, so CPR was ongoing. We were using anything and everything to warm her up, including warming her blood and even pumping warm saline into her abdomen. 7 hours of CPR, and one of the best consultants I have ever had the pleasure of working with, and the girl somehow survived. Even more shocking, she had survived with no brain or organ damage. I can barely believe it, and I was there. Guy comes in, just got hit by a bus. He looks like he's on his way out and not gonna make it. We check him out, and it seems that almost every bone in his body is broken or fractured, maybe internal bleeding. He somehow starts mumbling something about "stop hurting, be awesome." He proceeds to make a miraculous recovery and even commands his friend to give him a high five while in a full body cast. Was his name Barney? I used to work with the homeless and people in active addiction. I'm sure doctors have some big stories to tell about those two groups. I've seen people live outside in bitter cold while severely underweight and basically starving, getting IV antibiotics for MRSA and having Hep C and HIV, not to mention the poison they are shooting into their veins. Then eventually they get majorly beat up or hit by a car, but still keep going. It's just shocking how much abuse the human body can take. Or you can slip on the way to the bathroom and die instantly. So strange. In my case, I wonder which it's going to. When I was in 7th grade I hit a tree on a sled. The snow was frozen. I got a good bit of speed, hit a frozen snowbank, caught some sick air, and then bounced off a tree. The first lucky thing I noticed was when an EMT who had been driving by and saw it came to help. According to him, I had passed his car, driving 15 to 20 miles per hour on the icy mountain pass road, nearing his turn on the sled, and should have severely damaged or shattered my skull or spine. Only injuries I had noticed was a broken femur, which is still fairly nasty. After surgery and all the other stuff, the surgeon gave me some rather interesting information. That was my only injury, and it wasn't as bad as it should have been. Apparently, it takes so much force for the femur to break that it will typically shatter into 3+ pieces, making putting it back together much harder. Mine was a clean break. Even weirder was the lack of any other injuries. I mean any. Not even a bruise from the impact. On a side note, I don't go sledding anymore. The main takeaway here is that you managed to snag some sick air. Man walks into our emergency department. Few scratches on the left side of his face. Singed eyebrows. Bit of a limp. What happened to you? Put my car in a ditch. So this happens a lot. People crash their cars and figure they should probably get checked over, so they come to A&E and they are largely fine. This guy, however, left out some important details. Firstly, he'd been driving a 1999 Toyota something or other at about 95 miles per hour. Secondly, he hadn't been wearing a seatbelt. Thirdly, the reason his car left the road was because it had caught fire. Fourthly, he was elected through the windscreen and into a tree. On closer inspection, he had brush and undergrowth stuck in his hair, teeth, and nose, not to mention itty little bits all over his clothes. Fifthly, he had been unconscious for an hour or so. He knew this because he had just checked the time prior to leaving the road and had checked again when he regained consciousness. Since he'd been in the middle of nowhere, he had had to walk something like 6 miles to get to the hospital. Why on earth didn't you call an ambulance? Didn't really think I needed one. Full trauma protocol and several scans later, and he had a small bleed inside his head, 3 busted vertebrae, 1 in the neck, 2 in the chest, a small bleed on his spleen which had just so happened to stop, and a broken wrist. Seriously shouldn't be here. Just lucky. I'm not a doctor, but this is my story. I was working in Joplin, MO when a tornado hit in May 2011. When I got out of the wreckage I saw a large metal pipe, about 4 inches in diameter, sticking through the windshield of a red truck. I went over to check on the car and there was a small girl in the front seat. The pipe had completely punched through center of her body. I have a little medical training from my old job and started to do what I could. Just the basics of keeping her calm, high heart rate equals fast bleed out, awake, and applying a BVM I kept in my now destroyed car. Grandma was a nurse and gave it to me for an emergency. There were no cell phone towers left. I couldn't call 911 and report my location, so it took about 30 minutes for the professionals to get on scene. They managed to cut the seat out of the car, break the pipe at the ends, and transported both the girl and seat to the hospital. She lived and is doing well for the most part, considering the seriousness of the injuries. The pipe came in at a slight angle and missed her spine, which was very fortunate. MD here was at the hospital and this kid slipped into the small fish tank and cracked the side. He was bleeding from his left cheek profusely. He gets to the and I run back to the fish tank 2 minutes later and see one of the fishes still flapping. I ask him, how the hell are you even alive? Flapping stopped. Had he reincarnated as a rock?